Sup y'all, and welcome to Foundations of Civilization, Part 7. In this video today, we're going to take a look at the pre-globalized world and continue to look at the post-classical era. The European continent became fragmented after the fall of Rome in 476 CE, bringing about the Middle Ages that spanned from that time into the 15th century CE. A system of feudalism emerged with thousands of relatively independent fiefs, or lands, that were presided over by lords, or the nobility. These lands were tended by millions of serfs, who were peasants bounded to the estates on which they farmed. The Catholic Church grew to become the most powerful entity across Europe, possessing vast tracts of land. The lords, kings, and church officials sought to maintain the status quo, promoting as little change as necessary in order to maintain their positions of power. A significant reason they were able to accomplish this was due to the medieval warm period, in which warmer temperatures lasted from around 950 to 1250 CE, expanding farmlands and reducing the need for change. By the 11th century CE, Islam had spread and effectively taken over approximately two-thirds of the old Christian world. For instance, most of Persia had converted to Islam, although they primarily followed the Shia branch of Islam, whereas most Muslims were Sunnis. As a result of Muslim expansion and a rallying call for the expansion of Christendom, the Crusades were waged over a period of nearly 2 centuries, with a major goal to reclaim Holy Lands, especially in the Middle East. However, very little was actually accomplished through the Crusades, aside from massive loss of life on both sides. Nonetheless, tens of thousands of Crusaders came into contact with foreign cultures and luxury goods, increasing the demand for renewed trade with the East. On that note, around the time the Europeans were crusading across the Middle East, the Chinese had become the richest, most skilled, and most populous empire in the world. Due to their vast resources and Confucian culture, they saw themselves as mostly self-sufficient. The Chinese did trade, but they did not seek out other trading partners. Instead, the Chinese established a tribute system, forcing foreign powers to submit to Chinese authority and pay a yearly sum. In turn, they would not be attacked, and China would allow them to trade in their lucrative markets. In contrast to China's centralized empire, South Asia, anchored by India, was a fragmented expanse of regional kingdoms and vast cultural diversity. North and West African empires benefited from increased trade, especially along the Sand Road. Powerful cities thrived along important transport nodes by the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the Niger and Congo rivers. These cities were usually strongly influenced by Islam, which diffused through the Sand Road as well. A Swahili-speaking civilization took hold on the east coast of Africa, especially due to the sea road across the Indian Ocean. These independent city-states ran from Somalia down to Mozambique and shared a common language, Swahili, and religion, Islam. Nonetheless, they competed against each other for trade and sometimes fought against each other for territory. The Maya civilization collapsed largely due to a long-term drought beginning in the 9th century CE. They overconsumed their resources, and even though the Maya culture continues to this very day, their great cities were all but deserted by the early 10th century CE. The Aztecs developed within Mesoamerica around the 12th century CE. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, became the focus of their power and organization. The Aztec Empire was primarily built upon a coalition of various city-states, and the Aztecs became the undisputed power in Mesoamerica. That is, until the arrival of the Europeans in the early 16th century. The most powerful empire to emerge in South America were the Inca, forming around the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru in the early 13th century CE. One of their most famous cities, Machu Picchu, in Peru, was abandoned with the arrival and domination of the Europeans. But it has become the largest tourist attraction in all of South America. However, the undisputed greatest empire during the post-classical era goes to the Mongols. Among the arid steppes of Central Asia, a nomadic society of scattered tribes and clans grew into the largest land-based empire in human history. Starting under Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, in the early 13th century CE, the Mongols began a half-century of expansion and warfare. Their armies were highly disciplined and proved to have no equal on the battlefield. Regional powers such as the Chinese, Persians, and Russians resisted, but ultimately fell. The Mongols conquered and pillaged, but ultimately united most of Asia into a single interconnected network. The Silk Road was brought to its greatest era of interaction through the increased exchange of goods and technology. However, increased contact eventually led to one of the worst diseases in history. This, along with quadrillions and quadrillions of its relatives. What you're looking at is the Yersinia pestis bacterium, known as the Black Death. Hitching rides on fleas, who in turn hitch rides on rats, the plague first made its way into the Italian city ports around 1347, where the rats would multiply and spread throughout Europe. It would infect entire populations with frightening virulence. Symptoms included horrible weakness associated with the emergence of buboes on people's skin, which is where the bubonic plague gets its name. Now, get ready for the word of the day. Buboes are essentially pustules. Eventually, they could turn into black spots on the skin, which is where the Black Death gets its name. Death was common, and by 1351, when it began to subside, many estimates are around 30%, but as many as 50% of all Europeans had died. It would take 150 years for Europe's population to recover. By the time the Black Death had died down, property values plummeted due to the heavy loss of life, which in turn reduced the demand for land. This had the effect of weakening the power and diminishing the wealth of the feudal lords. The survivors of the plague inherited property and money from their relatives, which enabled many to pay rent for their land, throw off their feudal obligations, and live as freemen. This coincided with the rise of humanism, which emphasized human freedom and critical thinking. Careful study of classic literature from the Greeks and Romans increased social mobility, and a return of stability and trade enabled Europe to transcend into a new era of progress, the Renaissance. The Europeans had grown from a backward continent to a center of wealth and technological development. Entering the early modern era, the world had graduated from the post-classical era, with the Europeans most likely to succeed.
Well, Lottie